also called the Great War. The war started in 1914 after the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was killed by Gravillo Principe. But that was not the main cause of the outbreak of the war. Different causes were extreme nationalism and alignments between different nations in Europe. Another cause was the arms race between different nations. Gravillo Principe was just the final straw. During the conflict, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, called the Central Powers, fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Japan, and the United States, called the Allied Powers. But what began as a small conflict in just Southeast Europe became a war between European empires. The fighting occurred not only the west front of Europe, but also the east, southeast of Europe, Africa, and of course the Middle East. The Great War was also known for its rapid technological developments. Advances in the weaponry and military technology provoked tactical changes as each side tried to gain an advantage over the other. The introduction of aircraft into war left soldiers and civilians vulnerable to attacks from above for the first time. Major innovations were also made in manufacturing, chemistry, and communications, but we will tell you more about it later on. By the time the war was over and the Allied powers claimed victory, Germany was seen as guilty. In just 4 years, more than 60 million people, soldiers and civilians died. In tonight's broadcast we will talk about the weapons in the First World War, the vehicles and the weapons of mass destruction. But first of all, we will introduce you to Bas van Roosendaal, our weapon expert.
Thank you, Mats. First of all, I want to give a little bit of information about the weapons that were used before the First World War. In Roman and medieval times, they mainly used melee weapons like swords, clubs and axes. They also used a bow and arrow, but it wasn't very effective. When the gun was invented, it changed warfare forever. They could now be fought from a distance, and the main negative point was that the guns were really bad, they weren't accurate, and they often misfired. In the First World War, the weapons were more efficient, better and deadlier. That meant a big change for warfare. The introduction to trench warfare was a result of this. There were 4 categories of weapons that were used in the First World War. You had handguns, that were used for close quarters combat. You had rifles, also called bolt-action rifles. Bolt-action meant you had to manually put the bullet in and load it into the chamber every time you had to take a shot. You had also, the step up from that were repeaters. Those were lever action, which meant every time you had taken a shot, you had to manually reload a bullet into the chamber, but you didn't have to put the bullet into the gun. Machine guns were the ultimate weapon. They fired really fast and you only had to reload once your magazine was empty. These weapons were the staple weapons of the First World War. An example is the Lee Enfield that the British used. Melee weapons were also really important during the First World War. When the gas was dropped by the Germans, we will talk about their show later about this. The Germans ran behind it with gas masks on and melee combat ensued. The main weapon that was used in the melee, in the trenches, was the shovel. It was also used for digging and was really efficient with the sharp edges. Another weapon was the kukri. It was a knife from India with a curve in it, and the British used this because India was a British colony. It was a really deadly knife. The trench club was another weapon that was used. It's like a police baton nowadays, but just much more lethal. The staple of the First World War may be the shells. You may have heard the term shell shock before. It's a term to describe traumatized soldiers from the First World War. Shells were grenades that were put into mortars and shot off. Imagine this scenario. You had 2 trenches. The British were here, the Germans were here. They couldn't really get up to shoot each other because then they would be shot. What was the most efficient way to kill the other party? Well, it was to shoot shells, or grenades also called, from their own trenches without having to get up into the others. That's what mortars did. Another weapon that was pretty popular, now it's mostly widely known, was the flamethrower. Invented by the Germans, it was also called a Flammenwerfer. This weapon may seem very efficient and very cool, but it actually wasn't efficient at all. It was more for intimidation used, because the gun would often misfire and then the user would be blown up. Also, the flames didn't really kill anyone fast, they were just set on fire. Well, how did these weapons actually affect the weapons today? Our weapons today are mostly based off those weapons. Look at the assault rifles we now have. They are fully automatic, efficient, deadly and precise. In the Second World War, the same weapons were used, just much more developed. The First World War marked a big staple for warfare in our age, and it had an effect throughout history to our times now. Thank you, Mats. Back to you to the studio.
Thank you, Bas. Now we will switch on to Bastein, our vehicle expert.
Thank you, Mats, for this introduction. A new technology was crucial for the Great War with the railway systems. Railways were used to transport artillery and soldiers to the front. Without these railway systems, war couldn't have lasted so long. It was also important to deploy and gather your troops faster than the enemy did, because if you did that, you had a pretty solid advantage. It was especially important for the German Empire to do that because of their geographical positions that left it surrounded. That's the reason why trains were so important in the Great War. The first real railway action was at the Franco-Austrian War of 1859, where they transported 9,000 men and horses per day by rail. The Germans were the first to have a dedicated railway battalion, and their first locomotive was called the Zwillig, or the Twin. The Germans had planned to make transportation with trains go as smoothly as possible with tables of arrival. So when the war broke out, everything will go as smoothly as possible and as fast as possible. Armored trains were also used in the World War. They had cannons on them so that they could help the battles at the front. Now we're going to the next location and I'm going to tell you something about tanks. The biggest symbol of war of the last 100 years is unquestionably the tank. The tank was developed during the First World War. Other armored transportation devices were already used, but the problem was to come up with something that could be used on the blasted ground, right over the trenches and over the barbed wire. The caliper tracks were already used for agricultural purposes. The demands for the invention of the tank was that it should drive at least 4 miles an hour, climb a 5-foot wall, cross an 8-foot trench, reverse, and should be able to fight as well. The first tank was built by the British and it was called Mark I. So the French also wanted to build a tank, so they contacted Renault and asked them to develop a tank. Renault came up with a tank with a turret that could turn 360 degrees. Tanks were a great success for the French and for the British. So the Germans also wanted to develop one, but it cost a lot of manpower and a lot of research to build just one. So they came up with an idea to just steal a Mark I and put their own name tag on it. So they called it the Beutepanzer. I will see you at the next location. When the world went to war in 1940, the Wright brothers had already made the world's first powered aircraft a decade earlier. The first airplanes that took to the skies in 1914 were not seen as weapons, but were seen as scouts. The airplanes replaced men on horses were used to scout enemy territory. During the war, the French produced over 68,000 airplanes. 52,000 of them were lost in war. The airplanes had to be easy to control, because all the pilots didn't get much training. The average amount of time a pilot got training was 3.5 hours. There were a lot of advances during the Great War. In the beginning of the war, all the airplanes were produced how the Wright brothers invented them, with the motor facing backwards. They were called pushers. But the British came up with a new solution to put the motor facing forward, so the planes would go a lot faster. The British also experimented with putting weapons on planes, so they could take down enemy scouts or enemy fighters. Thank you for listening. Now back to the studio.
Thank you, Bastein. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our correspondent, Elon. He will talk about weapons of mass destruction.
That's correct. Thank you, Mats. The video I'm going to talk about today are the weapons of mass destruction. When you think about weapons of mass destruction, you probably think about the more recent years or Second World War, but they actually originated during World War I. The main one was the poison gas. Poison gas was firstly used by the Germans in the form of chlorine gas at the Battle of Ypres on 22nd of April 1915. Sorry. The British soldiers couldn't resist, or there was no effective help against these gases because the gas mask wasn't invented yet. So they had to pee or urinate on the piece of clothing to protect their lungs against these gases. The second weapon of mass destruction are the submarines. And submarines, I didn't really think about a weapon of mass destruction when I thought about a submarine, but actually, when I thought about it more, I think it is, because mainly of the story of the ship, the passenger ship, the Lusitania. The Lusitania ship there were 1,198 people on the ship, and they all died because of a bombardment by the German submarine. 128 Americans were included in these 1,198 people. So the Americans, the US, used this event to make propaganda and posters to recruit more soldiers. And it helped because many civilians joined the army after they saw the poster or heard about the Lusitania. So it is said that the war was Germans lost the war because of this event, because the US started involving even more, or as much as they did. The third mass destruction weapon are the aerial bombardments. These aerial bombardments were mainly done by Zeppelins because they were so silent. Because they were so silent. The civilians couldn't know they were attacked or bombed in just 5 minutes. So it was very effective, and there were more casualties. It was horrible. The Germans also started just using it on civilians, which was highly unappreciated by all the other nations, because there was a moral rule or unwritten rule that you just don't attack the civilians. But they did, and after all, they lost the war. But it was a horrible event. Many lives were caused by these weapons of mass destruction, and also the starters of these mass destruction weapons, they thought, well, it will speed up the war, but it totally didn't. So, thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Matt.
We have come to an end of our broadcast. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I hope you've learned a lot about the technological developments of the First World War. This was Bastein. I hope to see you next time.